Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight for this conversation with Rubin on the occasion of the publishing of his terrific new book, Uptown, Downtown in Old Charleston, which is available at the register afterward. Buy several. And Dr. Rubin will be signing them after we're finished here today. I also want to mention that some of his beautiful paintings, which I've observed over the years, are also out there and they're for sale. So buy a lot of those too. I especially want to thank Jamie, Land, and Sarah, and the rest of the folks here at Flyleaf Books, our great new independent bookstore here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, for hosting us. I also want to say hi to the Austrian American people who are watching. What is it that...
Send me a copy of these things.
What is it that made you think that you could be a writer when you didn't know you didn't know any writers? You didn't know who they were. This is when you were a kid.
When I said that, what I meant was that of course, I had an uncle who was a playwright, and another uncle who was a newspaper editor. So it wasn't as if I didn't have some kind of idea of what writing was, and so forth. But I didn't know what there was to it, and of course, I also made no distinction in my mind at that time between newspaper writing, playwriting, novel writing, any kind of writing you wanted, except as long as it wasn't in mathematics. So you have to learn as you go along what you can do and what you can't do. And I think I've learned what I can't do fairly well, but I haven't done too well at knowing exactly what I could do. And so I keep trying.
Very good, that answers my question. Now this is getting more into some of your thinking about writers in the South. And I'm going to set this up for the audience. You wrote this, so I don't need to read it again to you, but a thought occurred to me while recently reading something you wrote nearly 40 years ago. For the audience, I'll quickly summarize what you wrote, in which you describe what might be called the life cycle of the Southern writers who became great in the 20th century and were identified with the Southern Renaissance. And these are sort of the points of their lives. That they grew up in the South during a time of upheaval, when the old verities and consolations of the Southern agrarian small town grew insufficient, especially for those who had become the great writers, that they left their homes, often for the North, and often for big cities where they might live and work in freedom, unbounded by tradition and obsolete manners, that they discovered if they weren't Thomas Wolfe, who stayed in New York City, that the city was too large and impersonal, that they had become, in your words, ciphers in the vast man-swarm, that they returned to the South and found they were unable to take up any sort of traditional role in their homes because the South had changed and so had they. That they may have remained in the South, but it wasn't necessary to remain for them to make their art. And finally, in this condition of a loving estrangement, which you describe in your book, what you call a spiritual detachment among these writers. They set themselves to the task of fashioning their own country because of the desire to affect, and these are your words, the desire to affect an order greater than the one everyday life could provide for their experience. Now it occurred to me when I read this, this is at the beginning of A Faraway Country, one of your great books. And in it you describe this sort of progression, and it applies. And it occurs to me that this progression of stages in the life of these 20th century writers, Southern writers, corresponds nearly exactly with the stations of Louis Rubin's life as we've learned of them in this very book right here. So what I'm wondering is, Did you experience the same development in the sense of moving away, coming back, and the spiritual detachment for yourself? And I'm thinking of in the book there's an account of your return to Charleston aboard Bull Weevil, which no longer has the same engine it had, but is still running the same line.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. I mean, have you experienced what Eudora Welty, Robert Penn Warren, Carson McCullers, Alan Tate, Catherine Ann Porter, William Faulkner, all of them, disenchanted, moved, returned, never part of the community exactly again? Have you felt that way?
You gotta know this thing works both ways. In that that rather pompous pronouncement that I made. You know, when you write something and you're 25 or 30, and somebody quotes it when you're 75 and 85, you're rather surprised by it sometimes. But I would have to say that how much of that pronouncement came out of my own experience, and how much of my own experience was shaped by the writers that I read. In other words, it works both ways. I don't think this so-called detachment and return necessarily has to be physical. It's more emotional. And when you look back, of course, the writers I was writing about who were contemporary writers in the 1950s and 60s are all dead now. That was a little while, that was a few years ago, as you know. I think the South that they lived in and grew up in, particularly the small town South, was, after all, in many ways a narrower, more insular, but also more concentrated and intense community than would be true with writers growing up today. I just saw two of my former students come in a few minutes ago, Lee Smith and Jill McCorkle. All right, Jill grew up in a small town, Lumberton, but it was right next to Highway Interstate 95. That's a little different than you might have grown up in Oxford, Mississippi in 1910 and so forth and so on. So I think that pattern holds, but it's not, I would ask myself now, if I were going to write that, to what extent is it different from any other writer? I think it was different in certain intense ways, but it worked